Have you ever felt like the place that should have been yours simply didn't exist anymore? That the embrace you were waiting for never came, and that suddenly you realized you were just filling a convenient space but never truly wanted? It's a feeling that cuts deep, like a silent knife. The realization that you've been forgotten, that your presence has become optional, almost invisible. Imagine investing every ounce of your love, saving your hard-earned money, preparing gifts with tenderness, and upon arriving, realizing everyone was already gathered, smiling for a photo where there was no room for you. It's tough, isn't it? As if life were screaming that you were always the supporting character in the story of those who claim to love you. But here's the most surprising thing. Sometimes it's in that moment of exposed loneliness that belated clarity is born. A moment when you understand that you no longer need to beg for shallow affection nor accept crumbs of attention. Because there's an emotional freedom that arises when you stop waiting in vain and start choosing yourself. In this story, we'll walk together through settings you might know well. An empty airport, a simple diner with warm pie, a cheap but honest motel, and, above all, a journey of rupture and reconstruction. It's not just a narrative of silent rejection. It's about restored dignity, about breaking cycles that never did you any good. Prepare to feel the pain of being forgotten, but also the peace of lighting a candle just for yourself. Because in the end, you'll realize that a true embrace doesn't always come from the one you've been waiting for most, and that sometimes, family is the one who chooses to stay, not the one who demands your presence. Want to discover how this painful journey turned into a conscious new beginning? Then come with me. It was an ordinary afternoon when the phone rang. On the other end, my son's voice sounded strangely sweet, almost syrupy. He asked if I had any plans for Thanksgiving, and before I could answer, he blurted out a sentence that pierced my heart. "It wouldn't be the same without you." For an instant, I felt alive again, as if the invisibility that had enveloped me for years had dissipated. That connection felt like a breath of life. He said the children were asking about me, that they were excited to see me. He spoke as if my presence were essential to the table being full. It was at that moment that I felt an old flame ignite. You know that feeling of being needed, of having a real place? This was it. I, who had so often been merely convenient, felt that this time, maybe I was wanted. As soon as I hung up, I stared at the phone for a long time. It was almost as if I was afraid to move anything and ruin that fragile emotion. Such a simple invitation, but it brought me a sense of excitement I hadn't felt in years. That request made me believe that, finally, my family still cared. I grabbed the envelope where I kept my emergency money, the same one I'd been hiding for months. I thought, if this isn't an emergency, then what is? And I decided I would buy the ticket. I would be the loving grandmother who would bring pies, gifts, and a wide smile to fill the house with warmth. I would be there, filling that empty table with me. In the following days, I began preparing myself with a care I hadn't even remembered. I bought a new, soft blue wool cardigan to feel elegant, part of the scene, and not a forgotten detail. I lovingly selected small gifts for everyone, books for the children, chocolates for my daughter-in-law. It was as if I were sewing, stitch by stitch, my way back to affection. With every detail, with every bag I filled, my heart felt lighter. It was almost like a return to my youth, to that time when trusting others seemed natural. I felt a genuine excitement, something I hadn't felt in a long time. This anticipation was so sweet that I didn't even notice the shadow of an old fear whispering in the background. But it's funny how sometimes hope makes us ignore subtle signs. There was something in my son's voice that seemed too calculated, as if every word had been rehearsed. I chose not to listen to that hint of doubt. After all, after so many years of silent rejection, who wouldn't jump at the chance to feel included? When the plane landed, I felt that butterflies in my stomach feeling that mixes anxiety and joy. I'd chosen my best cardigan and black low-heeled shoes to look polished and dignified. The airport was bustling with life. Children running to hug their grandparents, couples reuniting with tears in their eyes, flowers coloring their hurried hands. And there I was, waiting for the moment to be claimed too. I stood at the arrivals gate, watching every face that appeared. With every hug I saw, I imagined my own. But time passed, and no one appeared with my name on their lips. I checked my phone, reread the message confirming the invitation, and said to myself, they're on their way. Of course they are. But that silence was starting to tighten my insides. I didn't sit down. It felt like if I did, I'd be giving up, accepting the loneliness I'd exposed. I remained standing, my suitcase at my side, as if believing that at any moment a familiar smile would appear in the crowd. The clock ticked by, minutes that felt like hours. With each passing family, my chest felt heavier. The phone notifications vibrated. My heart raced, thinking it would finally be the message, "Mom, we're here." But no. It was just a social media update. And, curious, almost by accident, I tapped it to see. It was then that the pain came as cold as the air in the lobby. On the screen, a photo of my family. My son in the blue sweater I gave him last year. My daughter-in-law, radiant, tanned, surrounded by the children. The table was full, candles lit, a golden turkey, laughter. The caption read, "Full house, full hearts. Happy Thanksgiving from our family to yours." And in that moment, I understood. The table was full without me. I stared at that image as if I could find some sign of deception. But there wasn't. I wasn't there. There was no reserved seat, no empty chair waiting for me. It was just another photo with no space for me, proof that, to them, I was invisible. A convenient guest, never truly wanted. And you know what's strange? I didn't cry. Not there. I just took a deep breath, calmly put on my coat, and started walking toward the exit. While families hugged and headed home, I moved alone, like a lost package. It was as if each step echoed the sound of a cycle that was finally falling apart. With each step out of the airport, I felt the weight of reality settle on my shoulders. It wasn't just oblivion. It was silent, calculated rejection, wrapped in an invitation that was never truly intended. As the icy wind bit my face, the photo still throbbed in my mind. A cruel reminder that their lives were complete without me. There was a contained, almost dignified pain in realizing I'd prepared so much for a place that didn't exist. The empty table I'd imagined filled with laughter with me present was just fantasy. In reality, that photo with no place for me revealed what had already been there for years. I wasn't part of the core, just an ornament for when it was convenient. I walked slowly, as if trying to prolong the moment before facing the exposed solitude. I looked around and saw taxis packed with people heading to waiting homes. I, on the other hand, had no destination. It was just me and my rolling suitcase, rolling on the cold asphalt, with no one to ask if everything was okay. My phone vibrated again. For a moment, I still had hope. Maybe a message saying it was a mistake, that they were on their way. But no. It was just another unimportant notification, a reminder of how invisible I was to those who should see me. In that moment, I understood that waiting in vain would only prolong the suffering. I felt a strange mix of emptiness and belated clarity. It was as if a veil had fallen from my eyes, revealing everything I'd always known but never wanted to admit. How many times had I accepted scraps of affection, believing there was still room for me? How many times had I closed my eyes to the signs, pretending the distance wasn't so great? I didn't cry there. I didn't allow myself to. Instead, I straightened my coat, held my head high, and kept walking. It wasn't pride. It was survival. Because crying in that moment would be giving their oblivion more strength than it deserved. I wouldn't let them see me broken, even if no one was looking. And curiously, in that silence that surrounded me, something began to stir within me. It was as if, amidst the pain, I began to feel a breath of firm resolve. I didn't know where I would go, but I knew what I wouldn't do. I wouldn't go back to begging for a place in the life of someone who had already made it clear they didn't want me there. I left the terminal aimlessly, leaving behind that empty airport that echoed my own exposed loneliness. The city felt cold and gray, and each step resonated like a confirmation of what I already knew. No one was waiting for me. I didn't want to go back to the hotel or to any place that evoked expectation. I just wanted to disappear for a few hours. It was then that I spotted a small diner on the corner, a simple place with fogged windows and an old sign flickering faintly. I went in. The smell of fresh coffee and warm pie enveloped me like a discreet embrace. There were few customers, all silent, and a tired waitress greeted me with a happy Thanksgiving that rang truer than any message I'd received from my family. I sat in a corner on one of those worn vinyl sofas and ordered a slice of pumpkin pie with tea. When the dish arrived, I realized it had been years since I'd eaten something just for myself, without thinking about pleasing anyone else. Each bite was simple, almost banal, but suddenly this solitary moment felt more honest than any dinner filled with fake smiles. There, with a pie and a steaming cup in front of me, I felt pain and relief walking hand in hand. Pain at being forgotten, at sitting alone on a holiday that was supposed to be about togetherness, but also relief at no longer having to pretend I couldn't see the truth. It was as if, suddenly, the silence began to free me. As I watched the street through the window, I saw families hurrying with bags, hasty hugs happening on the sidewalk, and I realized that not all of these encounters were real. Some, perhaps, were just disguised obligations. I'd experienced this before, presence without genuine affection, just out of habit. At that moment, I thought that perhaps it was better to be alone than merely convenient. The waitress asked me if I wanted another slice to go. I smiled slightly and accepted. Not because I was hungry, but because that pie was a little gift to myself, something simple, but mine. It was the first gesture of self-care in a long time, without being tied to anyone else. When I left the diner, I felt the cold air hit my face, but I didn't mind. I clutched the bag with my second slice, like someone carrying a piece of courage for the next step. I still didn't know where I was going, but for the first time, I felt like I didn't need to run to anyone. For the first time, I could just walk without asking permission to exist. I left the diner unhurriedly, feeling the weight of my coat and the small bag with the second slice of pie dangling in my hand. The city seemed too quiet for a day of celebration. I walked a few blocks until I found a cheap motel, one of those simple ones, with a worn sign advertising rooms available. I entered without hesitation. It wasn't luxury I sought, just a temporary shelter for my wounded dignity. The room was exactly what I expected. Dim lights, a thin blanket, and a creaky heater. But there, somehow, I felt something I no longer found in my son's house. Honesty. It was a cheap place, yes, but it didn't pretend to be anything more than it was. I left my suitcase propped up in the corner and sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the exhaustion seep into my bones. The phone vibrated. A short message. "Mom, where are you? We thought your flight was tomorrow." Soon after, another one, this time from the daughter-in-law. "Sorry for the misunderstanding. Can you come over for dinner tomorrow?" I stared at those words and realized there was no real regret, just an attempt to make amends. I didn't respond. For the first time, I decided not to fill the silence for them. The night was long, but not as painful as I'd imagined. That cheap motel, with its hard bed and thin walls, was a place to pause, a place where I could finally let go of the mask of someone who always ran to save the family's image. There, no one expected anything of me. And curiously, this emptiness brought a sense of emotional freedom I'd never felt before. As the heater creaked, I began to reflect on how many years I'd lived trapped in an invisible dependency, thinking I needed to be indispensable to someone to have value. I realized I'd always been in the supporting role, never the center, always convenient, rarely wanted. That night showed me that maybe it was time to break cycles, to walk away without looking back. I took out a small notebook I carried in my bag and wrote, in firm letters, "I'm not extra, I'm not leftover, I'm not a detail in anyone's life." I read the sentence over and over until I finally felt like I believed it. It was simple, but it carried the power of a firm decision that had been forming for years without me realizing it. And before turning out the light, I did something symbolic. I lit a small candle I found in my purse, something I used to carry to calm my grandchildren. But this time, it wasn't for them. It was for me. A candle lit just for itself, illuminating a cheap room that, for one night, became the beginning of my conscious new beginning. The next morning, I woke before the sun, as I'd always done my whole life. But this time, it wasn't to make breakfast for anyone, nor to get ahead on tasks to make life easier for others. I woke up just for myself. I looked up at the ceiling of the motel room and felt a strange lightness. It was as if, finally, I'd stopped waiting in vain for someone who would never give me the place I deserved. I grabbed my phone, which was flashing with several unread messages. My son kept insisting with short sentences, while my daughter-in-law tried to justify it with tepid excuses. It was confusion. We thought it was tomorrow. But I knew. Forgetting was no accident. It was habit. And in that instant, I felt a belated clarity invade my chest. It was no longer about a lost dinner, but about years of accumulated invisibility. I remembered every small abandonment. Ignored birthdays, last-minute invitations out of obligation, and the long silences that always left me feeling merely convenient, never truly loved. And I realized it wasn't just hurt, it was a cycle I fed myself, believing true love could be born from crumbs. I decided then that this would be the last time. There would be no more automatic transfers to cover the problems they couldn't solve, no more access to my accounts, no more co-signing on debts. I would take back what had always been mine, my dignity, because the end of dependence isn't just financial, it's emotional, and I was ready to cut those ties. I returned home with this decision boiling inside me. The next morning, I went to the bank and asked to suspend every benefit they had been deducting. I revoked access, changed authorizations, and, for the first time, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It was as if the liberating silence took concrete form there, in those signatures. Then I sought out my lawyer and sat down with him to review my will. Each line I changed was a step toward my conscious new beginning. I removed my son's and daughter-in-law's names from any future rights and included only one, Emma, the granddaughter who always saw me as I am, the only one who always brought genuine affection, a willing presence, a genuine embrace without ulterior motives. When I left the office, I walked slowly down the street. The world seemed the same, but I was no longer. I felt that by breaking that cycle, something inside me was healed. Not miraculously, but with the serenity of someone who finally chooses themselves. For the first time, I wasn't an accessory in anyone else's life. I was the center of my own life. A few days later, the phone rang. It was a different call, without the weight of obligation. When I answered, I heard a voice that immediately warmed my heart. It was Emma, my granddaughter, the only one who had never treated me as invisible. She said she had received my letter, and, upon reading it, felt she needed to see me. "Can I come visit you next weekend, Grandma?" he asked, with such genuine affection that it almost made me cry. Emma was always different. While everyone else saw me as someone they could turn to only when they needed me, she saw me for who I was. She'd call just to chat, send pictures of her cat, tell me about her college exams, ask me for recipes. She never demanded anything more than my company. In that moment, I realized that, even in the midst of abandonment, there was still a true bond that remained. On Saturday, I went to the train station to wait for her. My heart was beating faster, but this time, it wasn't anxiety mixed with pain. It was a simple, peaceful joy. When she stepped off the train, with a wide smile and shining eyes, I felt that real embrace I'd waited so long for finally arrived. And it came without demands, without ulterior motives, simply a mutual choice. We walked home chatting like old friends. Emma noticed every detail of the neighborhood, as if she wanted to keep that moment in her memory. When we entered, she took off her coat and walked around the living room like someone who belonged there. There was no formality, no tension, just a willing presence, the kind of companionship that doesn't weigh down, that demands nothing more than being there. That afternoon, we made tea and brought out the old chessboard I'd kept for special occasions. We played, laughed, and she told me about her plans for the future. For a moment, I realized it wasn't the laden table for dinner I needed, but the real connection that only exists where there is true love. With Emma, I wasn't just convenient, I was important. As she helped tidy the kitchen, I found myself looking at her with gratitude. That weekend showed me that family isn't someone who invites you to fill a space out of habit, but someone who chooses to stay, even when there's nothing to gain. It was as if life was saying to me, "You still have someone to see you." At night, before going to sleep, Emma hugged me and said softly, "I don't want you to feel alone ever again." I smiled and replied, "With you here, I've never really been alone." And I realized that sometimes a true bond is enough to heal the echo of many voids. Days after Emma returned to college, I heard a knock on the door. 3 slow, almost hesitant knocks. When I opened it, I saw Malene, her daughter-in-law, with that calculated expression that mixed concern and convenience. She was impeccable as always and had a rehearsed tone in her voice. "We need to talk." I didn't respond immediately. I just gave her space to enter. We sat in the living room, she in a corner of the armchair, me in the chair next to her. It was the first time I realized how her presence never truly filled the atmosphere. Malene began with the usual speech, that it had all been a misunderstanding, that Greg had mixed up the dates, that the photo he'd posted wasn't intended to exclude me. Each word came across as polite, but empty. I looked at her calmly, without interrupting. I no longer needed to justify my feelings. When she finished, she simply said, "It's not about one dinner. It's about all the years I was forgotten." I saw a small discomfort cross her face, but she tried to regain control. "We can't stay stuck in the past, Irene. We need to move forward." I took a deep breath and replied firmly, "Moving on isn't pretending nothing happened. Moving on is stopping it from happening again." She hadn't expected that response. She was used to my docility, to the silence that always filled the gaps for her. But now, the silence belonged to me. It was a shield, no longer a prison. Malene then changed her tone. She tried to appeal to family ties, saying that the kids missed me, that Greg was worried. But I knew that this speech was just an attempt to maintain the benefits they'd always had with me. I smiled slightly and said, "Did they miss me or what I did for them?" The question hung heavy in the air. She looked away, uncomfortable. She even tried to argue that I was being radical, that we'd always been a family. So calmly, I concluded, "We were, yes. But a family only lasts when there's respect. I'm no longer a convenient pawn in this game." It was the first time I saw Malene speechless. She stood up slowly, adjusting her coat as if trying to regain control. At the door before leaving, she tried one last move. "Greg will want to talk to you." I just replied, "He can try. But this time, I'm the one who decides." The door closed, and with it, a cycle of dependence and disrespect finally ended. A few days after Malene's visit, the phone rang again. It was Greg. I answered, unhurriedly, with a serenity I'd never felt before. His voice sounded different, more tense, almost begging for a space he himself had emptied. "Mom, we need to talk. I don't understand what's going on." I was silent for a moment, letting him feel the weight of the echo I had felt so many times. He began to justify himself. He said there had been a mix-up with the dates, that they hadn't meant to keep me waiting at the airport. He tried to paint it all as a misunderstanding, a passing hiccup. But for someone who's lived through years of small oversights, there are no such things as mishaps. There are patterns. And I finally saw the pattern. I took a deep breath and spoke calmly. "Greg, it's not about one day. It's about every day that came before it. It's about every ignored message, every invitation made out of obligation, every forgotten birthday." On the other end of the line, he was silent, as if he had never thought of it as a whole, just as isolated moments that required no accountability. He still tried to defend himself. "But we're your family, Mom. We always have been." Then, with the same calmness that pain taught me, I answered, "You were my family. But you stopped being that way a long time ago." The sentence came out low but firm, like a door that closes slowly, without slamming, but that will never be opened again. There was a long pause. I could hear his heavy breathing, thick with disbelief. He muttered something like, "You are punishing us." He smiled almost sadly and said, "No, Greg, I'm just letting go. There's a difference." There I realized that, for him, I had always been the silent solution. And now, without my presence to fix the flaws, he felt the void he had created. He still tried to insist, talking about the children, about the importance of keeping the family together. But I no longer felt guilty. I simply replied, Love without respect is not love. Presence without care is not family. And for the first time, I was the one who decided to end the conversation. I hung up without anger, without resentment, just with the belated clarity of someone who's learned to choose themselves. When I put the phone down, I felt something different. It wasn't euphoria, nor revenge. It was peace, the kind of peace that comes when you're no longer a prisoner of other people's expectations. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. The cut was done. And strangely, it no longer hurt. After that last call, something inside me realigned. It was as if an old weight had finally dissolved. I began to look at my home with new eyes. I decided to rearrange each room, not to welcome guests or impress anyone, but to make the space reflect who I truly was. I placed fresh flowers in the living room, lit a candle just for me, and hung a simple wreath on the door. For the first time, everything was for me. I began to notice small details that had always gone unnoticed. The sweet smell of my own home, the welcoming silence of the mornings, the freedom to do things at my own pace. There was no longer the anxiety of waiting for messages that would never come, nor the discomfort of being remembered only when it was convenient. It was a conscious new beginning, without haste, without guilt. One day I sat on the porch with a cup of hot tea. I watched the neighborhood children playing, the neighbors passing by and waving. And I realized that life went on, but for the first time, I didn't feel left behind. On the contrary, I felt exactly where I was supposed to be, with myself. Restored dignity tasted sweet and calm. I began cultivating new habits. I returned to reading books I'd put aside for years. I wrote letters to myself, recording my feelings as if I were talking to a friend. I began walking every afternoon, appreciating the simple fact of having control over my own time. I discovered that solitude can be cruel when imposed, but liberating when chosen. Emma was still there, calling whenever she could, sending photos, asking how I was, and this genuine bond reminded me that there was still genuine affection in my life. I didn't need to be surrounded by many to feel loved. All it took was a real hug from someone who chooses to be by your side, not someone who shows up out of obligation. At night, sometimes, I still lit a candle, not to symbolize longing or sadness, but to celebrate the emotional freedom I had achieved. It was a small ritual that said, I am here, whole, without needing permission to exist. The silence, which once hurt me, was now a safe space, my refuge. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that you can stop waiting for someone to forget you. You can light a candle just for yourself, you can buy your own pie, you can start over right where you are, without needing an invitation to belong. Because in the end, true peace doesn't come from someone who forgot you. It comes when you finally remember yourself. So tell me, how many times have you waited in vain? How many times have you believed it was just a misunderstanding, when in fact it was already a pattern? How many times have you swallowed the silence, thinking it was better not to bother? Maybe you too have felt invisible, convenient, never truly wanted. But the truth is, you no longer need to beg for spaces that were never yours. There's immense freedom in stopping knocking on the doors of those who don't want you around. There's peace in lighting a candle just for yourself and rediscovering that your worth doesn't depend on anyone else's gaze. What if I told you that starting over isn't a distant path? That it starts today, right where you are? It's a simple but powerful choice. Choosing yourself. Choosing to break cycles that only hurt you. Choosing genuine affection and leaving behind everything that isn't true. Now I ask you, what are you still holding on to that you should have let go of already? Who are you still waiting for, even though you know they won't arrive? Think about it. And when you're ready, take the first step toward your own peace. If this story touched your heart and made you reflect, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, we'll always share stories that heal, inspire, and remind you that you're never alone.